Carl Jung said that alchemy was the dream from which science was born. That actually trying these methods, systemizing these methods to try and create gold led to the scientific method, basically.
That's right.
Yes.
Intriguingly, the alchemists did point to mercury as the substance that could perhaps be turned into gold. And we know with nuclear physics, that's true. That's the only substance. And we can do it nowadays, but the process is so expensive.
Very expensive, yes.
You just, you don't bother. So as a result, the rulers, they didn't give up. They still worked on it, but they realized, okay, we're not getting results that we can immediately use. So what do? Well, we have to get gold from somewhere. And this is where this other development happened. Because if gold is your money supply, of course, there is a big problem with that, the risk. Just think about nowadays. If I'm in say, London, a major city, I would not want to walk around with a lot of gold on me.
Sure.
And the police will advise you, don't do that. And that's 21st century.
Yeah.
So imagine, say, 13th, 14th century.
Right.
No, you don't want to walk around with this gold.
Yeah.
That's the reality.
Because it's a bearer asset and can be seized, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So, and of course, there is crime, there is violence. So what do? And what people did was, they realized, we have to put this gold where it's safe. But where is it safe? Ultimately, it's safe where, and that's what they found, with somebody who has gold already themselves, and they don't need to steal my gold, so I can deposit it with them. They work with gold. They have their own private army and a safe to, and private army to protect it, security people. So why don't they put it there? And these were the goldsmiths. They're working with gold, making jewelry for rich people, for the aristocracy, for the king. And that's what happened. Now, of course, you do need, when you place your gold with them, okay, I've got this gold bar here, I want you to look after, I'll pay you a small fee. You do need a receipt. Not because you distrust the goldsmith, but just for practical reasons. Well, accounting, one, exactly. But also, the goldsmith may get ill or may have a bad memory. It's like you need the record to make that claim. Or what if the goldsmith dies and somebody, his son takes over? You need a record to say this is my gold. So goldsmith deposit receipts came about. And the next step is also quite logical. Because if, let's say we're neighbors and you've got more land than you need, I'd like to build a little hut. I need a bit of land. And we come to an agreement, I buy this piece of land from you. It's how much? Okay, we agree on the price. Right, now, everything agreed. Okay, I want to pay you now. I can go to the city and there's the goldsmith. That's where my gold is. I can get the gold. Now I have to walk back, travel back, depending on how far that is.
Risk.
It's going to be risky. Yeah. I'll give it to you. What are you going to do with
Walk it back and
if there's a
deposit it.
chance, exactly, you'll bring it back to the same goldsmith. Listen, why don't I just give you my deposit receipt?
Yeah.
In fact, to make up the sum, okay, here's 3 deposit receipts of this money, and it's yours. And and everyone thinks that's better, that's more efficient, makes sense.
So the credit instrument becomes monetized at that point.
Now, at this point, actually, nothing much happened because the gold is stored and the deposit receipts, which are one-to-one linked to the stored gold, are used for transactions. That's actually quite efficient. And in a way, you've addressed the security problem.
Yes.
And nothing much else happens.
I often say, I say this point a lot, but it perfectly mirrors what you're saying here, that one good definition of money is that it's a device for moving purchasing power across space and time. And so in gold, we had something that's really good at moving purchasing power across time because it's a good savings technology. But for all the reasons you're highlighting here, the physicality of gold invites certain risk, opens you up to the threat of violence, coercion, etc. So we innovated around that basically by putting the gold on deposit with a goldsmith and then taking this deposit receipt that's much more portable, right? Much lower risk to transact in this, or what would later become an electronic representation of that deposit receipt or banknote. And so we gained the ability to have to move purchasing power across space really well with a gold linked currency.
Right.
And so it's great. That's a great monetary instrument, works really well, but it introduces this need to trust the custodian.
Yes. But this is really just where the story starts. That's the starting point. And really, we've become more efficient and we've become clever about it. There's, good use of this instrument to transfer purchasing power. Great. Now imagine what the Goldsmiths were saying. And of course, in those days, every profession, they were organized in guilds. They would meet regularly and they'd talk shop, literally. All the carpenters. And they had, of course, also their business because they're running quality control. They were examining people to become master of their trade, to then be allowed to practice. That's the system, the guild system. And so the Goldsmiths, when they get together, they were talking to each other and they noticed, well, hang on, nobody's picking up this gold. Actually, withdrawals are quite rare because, have you noticed, they're using our receipts to pay. This creates temptations.
Yes.
What is the temptation? Well, at the same time, of course, people realize, well, these goldsmiths, that's where the gold is. So let's say you need some money. Where do you go? You go to the goldsmith. That's where the gold is. Everyone knows that.
Yeah.
So a lot of people were, of course, going to the goldsmiths. Now, the goldsmiths were very much aware of the laws, and they were dealing with authorities and, kings and princes. So, of course, they, had to be careful. They would want to be within the law. And the law said, this was European law until 330 years ago in most European countries, charging interest is forbidden. It was illegal. But the people were coming to the goldsmiths and saying, can I borrow some gold? I'll pay you interest. Now, that created immediately this temptation that the goldsmiths were exposed to, and essentially they gave in. Okay, we'll lend out some of the gold at interest. And of course, it has to be secret for two reasons. Number one, charging interest was illegal. Number two, and it wasn't a minor thing. In the Bible, charging interest, in the list of sins, it is a capital sin right after murder. Murder is higher, and then comes charging interest. Wow.
Yes. Yeah.
So it wasn't a minor thing. But secondly, it had to be kept secret because you didn't want the depositors to realize
It's
that
not their gold, really.
some of the gold is not there. It's no longer deposited. Because really, this was a breach of contract now.
Yes, you're violating. They're reaping the reward, but putting the risk on the depositor.
Right.
Yeah.
So what happens is three things. Number one, breach of contract. The moment the goldsmith lends out money as a loan to somebody at interest. Breach of contract plus breach of the law, you're charging interest. An attractive business model comes about because you're charging for time, because interest accumulates over time. You don't have to do anything. Normally, if you start a business and you want to grow it, as you grow the business, you have to put in more resources. You've got some costs. And this is not true with interest.
Right.
So that's the second thing. It's a business model where you just sit back and as time goes by, you get more and more money. That's attractive.
Yes.
But thirdly, the money supply is expanding. Because the moment the goldsmiths were lending out some of the gold, it wasn't anymore this one-to-one relationship between the deposits, the gold deposit not circulating, and instead its image, the receipt circulating. So there's no macroeconomic implication. But the moment you lend out some of the gold, you've expanded the money supply. There's now in total more purchasing power chasing.
And aren't
things.
they lending to the actual paper receipts rather than the physical gold?
Well, you're talking about the next step.
Okay.
This is what happens next. Because, of course, the goldsmiths were smart, as you are. And they realized, well, I guess a few meetings down the road, they realized, okay, we've got to be careful. We shouldn't lend out all this gold, And they also realized, by the way, we need to collaborate. Because if somebody gets more demands, we need to collude.
Yeah.
So if somebody needs gold because they're, trying to, hand in their deposit receipts and get the gold out, the other goldsmiths need to help.
Yeah.
So there you create essentially the interbank market. The banks have to work together. It's still true today. Banking is a network industry, and banks have to constantly collaborate very closely.
Yeah.
If the automobile industry is very different. turn on my BMW, it'll work no matter what Mercedes-Benz is doing, but not in banking. You can't do even a simple transfer in most cases if the other banks or particular banks are not cooperating. It is a network industry, so that's a big difference. And so the Goldsmiths realized that, okay, we'll work together. But they also realized, and I guess a smart Goldsmiths had this idea, hang on, we don't need to lend the gold. I'll show you guys next time. This guy always comes around every Monday and wants a loan, and so far I've given it. I'll give it to him today, and I'll show you what we're going to do. So this guy comes around. Oh, please, I need this money. I'm bothering you again as the last few weeks. I need these 200 grams of gold. I need to pay this and that. And the Goldsmiths say, okay, I've listened to you, and you've been very consistent, and I think, okay, we can do it. Here's the usual contract with the small print, here's the interest, repayment schedule, collateral, your house, your wife, your 2 daughters, collateral. They will be sold into slavery, obviously, if you don't pay, the usual. But one more thing, it's a small thing, it won't bother you. Here's the gold, you see. I'll give it to you. I want you to deposit it with me once you've borrowed it. Oh, but I need the gold. Yes, and of course, once you've deposited with me, I give you the deposit receipt. Ah, okay. And yes, you can use the deposit receipt, as everyone is doing.
It's accepted by all the other banks in town too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, fine. That's fine. We'll do that. And so what happens now is much more dramatic. What we have is, this is no longer breach of contract. This is outright fraud. Why is it fraud? Because the Goldsmith is now issuing a fictitious deposit receipt.
Right.
Of course, the fiction is,
it's a liability with no asset behind it, basically.
Well, here's the gold. The Goldsmith lends the borrower the gold to then deposit it and then gets the deposit receipt. So on the surface, it seems proper. This is what double entry accounting was invented for. Because in double entry accounting, you can make this appear proper when actually it is fraud. Because you create an asset and a liability at the same time, you lengthen the balance sheet. But really, this is fraud. Why is it fraud? Because you can prove it's fraud in 2 ways. Number one, the guy who goes to the Goldsmith, before he borrows the gold, check. Does this guy have any gold on him? No. Then he leaves the Goldsmith with a receipt that confirms he's deposited gold. Well, how did that happen? He didn't have any on him, right? Secondly, check the total amount of gold at the Goldsmith. He's issued more deposit receipts now, but has the total amount of gold stored at the Goldsmith increased? No. Of course, they will say, well, we work together with the other Goldsmiths. Somehow we can, it's an interbank liability, and don't worry.
The truth is expressed in the ratio, right? That the liabilities have increased, but the assets have not. So
in double entry, everything is increased. That's why the double entry accounting
But that's the
works.
Illusory part, right?
Yes.
Because it's assets equals liabilities plus equity. Actual liabilities have increased.
The loan is the asset.
Yeah.
And the deposit is created the moment the loan is extended. The borrower's account at the bank is credited with the amount of money. So, but let me come to this. So this is now fraud. Secondly, the business model has just got even more attractive because you can now get revenue, get interest on income streams, and your cost is simply writing a deposit receipt.
And your risk is zero too. If they default on it, it's not even your gold that you lent out.
There are some things they have to watch out, but that again, if they collude with each other, they can manage these risks. And thirdly, the money supply now can really be expanded. And that's something you have to watch. And there are macroeconomic consequences, depending on what the money is used for. I'll come to that. That's my quantity theory of disaggregated credit, where you have to look at the money creation and its use. Because not all money creation leads to inflation. It depends. There's 3 scenarios, but I'll come back to that. And so the money supply expands, the third thing. And fourthly, a fourth thing happens. Banking is born. This is modern banking. Now, that is also explained by this third theory of banking, the credit creation theory of banking. So as I said, we have 3 theories. The financial intermediation theory, there's no money creation. Banks are just gathering deposits, lending them out. You have the fractional reserve theory, which is a bit of a mixture. It says each individual bank is just an intermediary, nothing much to see here. But somehow, yes, there is somehow money creation in the system as they interact in a slightly dubious sort of process that's not fully convincing when they explain. And thirdly, there is this credit creation theory, and that says banks are not financial intermediaries. Each individual bank creates money. Banks are creators of the money supply. And each bank creates money, how and when it gives out a loan. Now, I thought this is quite curious that we've had over the last century and a bit these three theories of banking. And economists argue about this, which one is it? And people, of course, the majority nowadays supports the financial intermediation theory. There's nothing to see here. Banks are just intermediaries, no money creation. But some economists would say, well, hang on, there's credit creation going on. So you do get these arguments. And of course, over the 20th century, you had different proponents of different theories. Schumpeter was supporting the credit creation theory. The fractional reserve theory was pushed by Keynes in 1930, although earlier he was aware and had supported the credit creation theory. And then later he would switch further even to the financial intermediation theory in his 1936 general theory. So it's very suspect what Keynes has been doing, moving further and further away from the truth. And then, of course, from the 60s, they've been pushing this financial intermediation theory. Tobin was asked to set up a whole new journal called Journal of Money, Credit and Banking, which by its title, you'd assume must be all about this. And anyone who discovers a bit of truth or realizes there's something about banks and credit, well, that seems like the right journal to look up. But no, it's completely ideological. It's all about banks don't create money. Banks just financial intermediaries. That's how this was really pushed in the last few decades. And central banks, of course, have been pushing this hard. Therefore, we can drop banks from macroeconomic models. When the 2008 crisis happened, the banking crisis happened.
Yeah.
The truth was, if the journalists interviewed an economist at, say, Harvard, MIT, or central bank economist, had they honestly answered, they would have said, well, sorry, I can't answer your question about the banking crisis. Why not? You're an expert. You're this famous professor of economics. Well, yeah, but our economic theories don't include banks. So how can I comment? That would have been the honest answer. Obviously, they were making up some stuff. They didn't want to admit that. But that's been the reality in these macroeconomic models. So,
and so that's by design, right? As you said, to exclude banking from economic models, basically to make them invisible and not subject to scrutiny.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this whole process of money creation, credit creation by banks should be invisible. But I thought, the scientific thing is to actually test these three theories of banking. And so I conducted the first empirical test, which is written up and published. It's the most downloaded paper of all Elsevier publications. One is called, and I made it open source, so you can just Google it, you'll get it. Can banks individually create money out of nothing? And the second one that was published 2014, and the second one published 2016 is Lost Century in Economics, because for the past century, this has been denied.
The same century of central banking. What did Ron Paul say? That it's no coincidence that the century of total war is also the century of central banking, is also this lost century of economics.
Yes, exactly. Lost economics, the lost century of lost century for economics is not economic truth. And also the century of rising taxes. All these things happen together. Warfare, taxes, centralization, central controls coming in. I did this test. I needed a bank to collaborate with me. And I found a bank, and I actually took out a loan, 200,000 euros in Europe, in a bank that was very representative because it was a cooperative bank, which is the largest number of banks are cooperative banks in Europe.
And what does that mean, cooperative?
Cooperative. It's like
cooperative.
Cooperative. Yeah. It's the governance structure of the bank is like a stakeholder bank.
Got it.
So it's not for profit, strictly speaking. It's for its members. And that's the largest number of banks in Europe are cooperative banks.
Okay.
Germany has by far the largest, but also Austria, Switzerland, Italy, lots of these cooperative banks. And in Germany, they all use the same system, the same IT, obviously the same accounting. In Europe, anyways, all standardized auditing rules and everything. So we know this is representative. I borrowed the 200,000 euros and I wanted to transfer it out of the bank. And the question was, where did the money come from when I received the loan? We actually had the BBC there filming on the day. And I had all the bankers in the room, and we watched them, what they were doing, and they showed us the internal, their system. And I could demonstrate, and they actually even signed that, confirming that the money for my loan did not come from deposits. It did not come from reserves. They didn't even check their reserves. They made no transfer of this money from either inside or outside the bank. It was newly added. Because really, the legal view of this makes it actually quite clear. Banks are not, economists always say banks are deposit-taking institutions that lend money. That's not true. The legal reality is banks don't take deposits and banks don't lend money. They don't take deposits because at law in England, where modern banking was created with the arrival of the Bank of England, the laws were also put in place. And at law, there is no such thing as a bank deposit. It doesn't exist. At law, the status of a depositor is simply a general creditor. It's a loan to the bank.
Right.
So deposits are actually our loans to the bank.
Right.
The tables are turned.
Right. And this is in the fine print of online banking agreements, even in the US, that you're not the customer, actually, you're the creditor to the bank.
Yes, that's right.
And they're the borrower.
Exactly.
And they can default on you.
Exactly.
Yes.
So on the one hand, we lend them the money, so they are the borrower. Then what about when they do what we call lending to us? Well, actually, what they do is they purchase our promise to pay. Our loan contract is a promissory note that we've issued. We've issued a security, an IOU. The bank buys it, and then it owes us money, right? Oh, but that's called a deposit when they owe us money, right? So they invent a new deposit because actually in accounting terms, you've studied accounting and audit, the accounts payable liability arising from the loan contract for the bank is now fraudulently, essentially, misrepresented as another type of liability called customer deposit. That's what it is.
Right.
And that's all it is. And that's how money is invented. That's how banks create money. So I could prove that. And so now it's established. Actually, there's two tests. Another test, this Lost Century in Economics paper. But I could prove empirically, peer-reviewed journal, it's no longer a matter of dispute that banks create money. And this is how, in most countries, around 97% of the money supply is created by banks. And of course, it started historically with these systems where, for example, with the Goldsmiths bankers, whenever you have a system where people deposit valuables and the deposit receipt can easily be created at very low value because it's either paper or it's wood or something, or clay even, then there is the temptation for the issuer to issue fictitious deposit receipts.
Yeah.
This. So now we know what really this was. This little clay tablet was this big. It already had quite rounded edges as if it's been circulating. 750 grams of gold. I mean, that's almost a kilo of gold. That's like what? In dollars, I don't know, it's like $70,000 or something. So, and it's only a piece of earth. So that's brilliant. That's alchemy, which just turned earth into gold, right?
Yes, right.
So how did this happen? And this is the answer to this puzzle. Why does this deposit receipt even exist? Does the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, need a deposit receipt? No, clearly not. It's when the temple gave a loan to the government through issuing a fictitious deposit receipt. But everyone will use these deposit receipts. They were used as money.
Right.
And that's why it's important because, of course, the name of the king and the prime minister on there is for credibility, the temple.
Of course.
And that's how it could be money.
So this is kind of the same reasons we have dead presidents on United States dollar bills. There's still this imprinting of political credibility onto financial instruments today. But still there's this scheme beneath the surface. It's a different scheme now, but it sounds like this was maybe its origin point actually.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what happened in Babylon. So the government could acquire resources, pay for the king's household, pay the army by essentially issuing these fictitious deposit receipts. But it was the government doing it through the temple that the king could control. And the same system came about in a slightly different way in England. And of course, the paper money system in China is another version. So the English system was really originally a tax system. When William the Conqueror had conquered England, next he was going to tax people. Well, actually, to be fair, not ordinary people. They had zero taxes. It was the rich people. And who were the rich? Well, it was his Norman barons, because they took all the land formerly from the Saxon rulers and barons. Some became outlaws. This is where Robin Hood, Robin of Locksley, the story, has its truthful origin, because the Saxon rulers were displaced. Some became outlaws fighting the Normans. But the ruling lords who had the big estates, a lot of land, farms, they were Normans, and William of Normandy, William the Conqueror, had put them in place because they come with him. They were his fighters, the leading army key guys that helped him take over England. Not all of England. London he did not take over, which makes us very suspicious. Instead, he marched up to London. He'd conquered the rest, but in London is where all the gold is and all the jewelry and wealth. And he didn't even try to conquer it. That's very strange. Of course, he had a lot of bills to pay to fund his army and his invasion, all the ships, to cross the channel. How did he pay for that? Well, my guess is it must have been the City of London paying him. And the deal obviously was the City of London will not be part of his empire, of his sovereign rule. That's the only rational explanation. Why would you conquer England except London, the one major target that you'd otherwise go straight for and forget about the rest, So that was the deal. And essentially he was told, well, you can tax England, you can tax the rest of the country. But the City of London, the square mile, which is today still separate, it's within London, a tiny territory where the Bank of England and all the banks are, became a sovereign territory outside the sovereign rule of the king. And that's true even today. So King Charles doesn't have the permission per se to enter the City of London Corporation. He has to ask for permission.
Wow.
He's not allowed to enter without permission because it's not part of his sovereign.
There is a money power above even royal political power in London today.
Absolutely. And it's a political reality that the City of London Corporation is a sovereign territory. It's not part of the United Kingdom. We know from this, the fact that the sovereign is not allowed to enter. And it has powers over the United Kingdom because they have a deal going where they can attend all the parliamentary meetings with an unelected City of London Corporation representative. For what purpose? To make sure that nothing happens in Parliament, no law is passed that's against the interests of the City of London Corporation. Wow. That is the reality in England. So William the Conqueror had this deal, and so he couldn't touch London, or, he stuck to the deal. They funded, I guess, they must have funded his entire campaign. But he was allowed to, of course, tax the rest, and that's what he did. And, of course, it was mainly his Norman barons that were now these rulers of these estates. He did a survey first, the Doomsday Book, quite an advanced survey for tax purposes of the land, like how big it is.
Old school census, basically.
Yeah, census, who owns it, how much can we tax is always the question. So whenever the government asks too many questions like that, what's coming next, taxes. And in Germany recently, a few years ago, they did this big survey of all the housing stock available. Everyone had to respond. It was unique, and people were quite concerned. And of course, they then started to increase property taxes, asset tax on housing, and so this the tax system was actually very sophisticated. It was the sort of center of it was the Norman Exchequer, which existed inside the Royal Treasury, which originally was in Winchester because that was the capital of England. London as a city didn't exist. There was the City of London. That's just been, ruled outside of William's domain, outside his kingdom. Then there was Westminster. Of course, later it sort of merged and became the political London. But in those days, there was only Westminster. But before Westminster became de facto the capital, it was Winchester, the old Saxon capital, where the Saxon kings are buried in the cathedral. And so he had a new cathedral built and his palace built in Winchester. And in the palace was the Royal Treasury with the magic exchequer. Now, the exchequer is named after the chessboard cloth that was put on a very large table, which was a giant abacus for calculating numbers, namely taxes. The taxes were gathered, the tax collectors were the sheriffs. They were the reeves, the counts, Grafen in German, the reeves of the shires, the sheriffs, shire reeves. And they had to bring the tax. Now, the system was the honest type of accounting, the single entry accounting known as charge-discharge accounting, because of the Norman Exchequer, because the sheriffs were charged. They were the accused in that court. They were summoned twice a year. And based on the Doomsday Book, there was a total amount of money they had to deliver in taxes. Of course, it was proper commercial business, so they had costs. And they could subtract the costs. There was a proper calculation, all the things they did, other people they had to pay.
All the coercion cost.
Well, you have maintenance, you've got horses, you've got staff, you've got this and that.
But these guys are physically going out into the countryside and extorting people for money and then remitting it.
But just to make clear, it was not from ordinary people. Ordinary people had zero taxes. It was the large landowners.
Got it.
They were extorting from the large landowners, but that was the deal they had with William. I mean, they were given the land by William. Essentially the king owned all the land. That was the Norman system, and then gave it out as lien. He could actually take it back if he wanted to, but they had to pay this tax on it. But ordinary people that didn't own an estate had zero tax, so it wasn't that bad as a system. But what they then did was quite clever. So they had this big chessboard, where the calculations were done. It was essentially a giant abacus.
And this is because they're using Roman numerals still?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's the same in the Chinese system, because when you have, one line is 1, 2 lines is 2, 3 lines is 3, like in both Chinese writing and Roman writing, it's very hard to do calculations. You need an abacus. So both the Romans had an abacus, and the Chinese and the Japanese, Soroban, have these abacuses for calculating. Of course, nowadays everyone uses calculators.
Well, once we got zero-based numeral system, it makes calculation a lot easier, and you don't need these.
Exactly. Precisely. Now, so that was the name of the source of the name. This exchequer. The Normans were speaking French, and in French it's Czech. Is the name for chess. It's chessboard. Now, this Norman Exchequer had these 2 sessions twice a year where the sheriffs were summoned. It was a court, a high court, and there were court proceedings, and they were the accused. And in these court proceedings, they then had to bring the money or the evidence, the receipts. If they'd spent something on permitted expenditure, bring the receipts, It's just proper accounting. It was also spoken, so it was auditing, audiere, to listen. There were all the experts were listening. It was a court of audit as well. And records were made. The records were issued, were written on cowskin vellum and rolled up. It's quite thick and lasts, 1,000 years. So this was 1,000 years ago. We still have those records. they were rolled up as a counter, check. And in French, that is contre-roll, the counter roll to check, contre-roll. This is where the word control comes from the contre-roll of the exchequer.
Fascinating.
The word check, writing a check, comes from the exchequer.
Yeah.
And for good reason, because there were checks issued.
And audit and auditory had a connection. That was interesting
the
too.
audit comes from there. And the checks issued were the tally sticks. Now, what were they? They were essentially a wooden stick, which notches were put in, and then it was split in half. It was the split tally. That created what in Bitcoin terminology we call a public key and a private key. The longer bit, one was longer, one was shorter. The longer bit was kept in the Royal Treasury as a sort of public key, and or you can call that the private key. And the other one was circulating. The shorter one was the stock, from German Stock, stick, because there was a stick of wood that was circulating. Now, these tally sticks were tax receipts. So when the sheriff had paid taxes, he received the receipt. And they were valid in future, because you met twice a year, in a future exchequer session. You could use them as a receipt that you've paid tax to the government. And so they circulated as money. It also meant that the government could spend without limit. There was no budget limit. And therefore there was money creation, because the government, the king, could say, well, we need to buy some more cows, we need meat, or we need horses, whatever. You go to the estates where there's the farms and the resources. Well, okay, we acquire these. What is the price? Okay, we agree on the price. Here's your payment. It's a tally stick. It's a tax receipt, because now you've paid future taxes to the government and you can use in the future. Okay,
so they're giving them a tax credit.
Exactly. It's a tax credit. And so, of course, money is whatever you can use to pay taxes. That's another...
In the statist paradigm, yes.
Reliable definition. If you have taxes, then of money and what will be accepted for money. And it worked because you couldn't forge these because of the split tally. Because when you split the wood, it's like a fingerprint. The grain of the wood is unique. So you could always check, go back to the Royal Treasury. I think this could be fake. Okay, let's check. And you put them together. If they match, they tally. And if they don't match, so one was the stock and the one kept in the treasury was the foil. If they don't match, you were foiled.
Foiled, yeah, wow.
So all these expressions come from there.
And stockholder came from the other one,
stocks and shares comes from that tally stick.
Yeah.
Because later when the government was then issuing government debt, it would be called a stock. Because that's how the government, because basically issuing these tax receipts was a debt that the government had.
Interesting.
And so that's where the first government bonds, came about, and they were stock, and they were called stocks.
Yes.
And then, of course, later it was used when companies do the same, okay, let's call it the same.
Yeah. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.